Hello and welcome to Roundtable. The French President Emmanuel Macron, always keen to be seen as the international statesman, has now brought together 44 EU and non-EU states in a group called the European Political Community. And it's meeting for the first time on October the 6th. Motivated by Russia's conflict with Ukraine and the latter's desire to join the European Union, Macron first proposed the idea of this forum in May, touting its main purpose as a platform for multilateral dialogue and cooperation. But will this disparate, what's been called a club of nations, fail like the one proposed by a previous French leader more than 30 years ago? Or will its members actually stand stronger together against Russia's belligerence? Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. It's all a bit short on detail at the moment, but non-EU Britain, Ukraine and Turkey are all on the invitation list for the meeting in Prague. How useful could the EPC be? And with such varied membership, could any attempts at cooperation get bogged down by competing interests? We will go first to Charles Grant in London, Director of the Centre for European Reform. Then Philippe Marliere, Professor of French and European Politics at University College London. And we bring in, last of all, Jonathan Liss, Deputy Director of the British Influence. Jonathan, we'll find out what the British Influence these days is, if anything at all. Let me come to you first of all, Charles. European reform, is this the sort of thing you want to see, or is it just another boring talking shop that will achieve nothing?
I think it's a very good idea indeed. I think the background to this is the war in Ukraine. President Macron thinks that European countries need to stand together to increase Europe's geopolitical weight vis-à-vis the rest of the world at such a difficult and stressful time. And if the 44 countries meet together, there may be a little bit more alignment of thinking on the big strategic questions than if they did not meet together. But there are specifically three reasons why Macron set up this group. Firstly, he wants to find a way of socialising the British, to include the British in a European forum post-Brexit so that they don't fall off the edge of Europe completely. Secondly, closer links between the EU and the Balkan countries, which are having to wait forever for the enlargement process to make progress. And this could lead to closer ties with the Balkan countries even before enlargement happens. And thirdly, give Turkey a forum where it can have a closer relationship and develop some mutual understanding with the countries of the European Union. Those are the three reasons he's doing it. And I think it's a very good idea indeed.
We will look at some of those countries in more detail in just a moment. But Jonathan, since we've heard from Charles that this is set up in part, not in large part, but in part to include the UK in this, does that suggest that the UK still has a great deal of influence when it comes to international politics?
I think that we have to acknowledge that the UK, despite the loss of much of its soft power over the last few years, particularly with Brexit, it's still clearly a major world power. It has a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. It's in the G7, etc. And so obviously any international grouping that spans different continents would want the UK to be part of it. And certainly any European organisation that wants to discuss political issues would be boosted by the UK's presence. And I'm glad that they've made allowances for the UK, that they've kind of toned down the role of the EU Commission in this new body. And I'm glad the UK has decided to participate, because the UK should be engaging with its neighbours.
Philippe, other than having an extra 17 countries on top of the 27 EU members, how does it differ from the European Union, this?
I think it will be very different. As Charles Grant said in his opening remarks, I think it goes beyond the EU and the institutions, notably the way the EU functions. You know, it's a fairly heavy and complex set of institutions here. I think we should see the European political community as a kind of forum, above all. Probably not necessarily there to make policy. Maybe there will be some policy outcomes, but I don't think that should be the priority. The priority is more to meet, to socialize, and to take stands, you know, in particular at this moment in time with the war in Ukraine. I suppose it's important for European countries within and outside the EU to be seen as talking to each other.
But let's say the leaders of Iceland and Albania wanted to find out what each other's problems were, they don't need to come to something like this. If they had any real interest, they could pick up the phone and talk to one another.
Yes, fair enough. But the case you just given is that it's a case of bilateral relations. Here, we're talking about 44 countries being put together in the same room. And I think in terms of media attention, political clout, we're on a different stage here. And I suppose that's what Macron, then Scholz, and all the people who finally came to the view that it might be a good idea to do that, probably are sort of having this idea that, you know, sort of reaching a kind of critical mass, putting together all the nations inside, outside the EU, members of NATO or not. And I think this is making a very big political statement.
What about the countries that are on the outside of the European Union that have been invited? Charles, I'll come to you on this one and pick out a couple of them. There you can see the list of the 17 others, beginning with Albania alphabetically and ending with the United Kingdom. You previously mentioned, or somebody did, Turkey and the UK, possibly Norway. Which one of these is going to get the most advantage from being part of this club? Would it be the UK, because it's now completely outside everything pretty much?
I think there is a great need in the UK for just more face-to-face contact with European countries, because now that we're not in the EU, British ministers and officials no longer turn up to frequent meetings with ministers and other EU officials. So they don't know what's going on. They're quite ignorant. And a talking shop like this gives Britain a chance to learn what's going on, influence the conversation and build up a few friendships. But I think one way of judging whether the club is a success or not, according to a French official I talked to, was let's see if countries like Serbia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, which are not always clearly in the pro-Western camp on the issues relating to the Russia war, let's see if the peer group pressure of 44 heads of government altogether actually pushes such countries to be a little bit more sympathetic to the West than they otherwise would be. That could be a measure for a way of judging whether the club is a success or not.
Well, since diplomacy comes into this, they may be diplomatic and say, yes, we do feel that way, much more sympathetic to the West, and then go back and do exactly what they were doing before.
Well, they might do. In that case, the club wouldn't be achieving one of its objectives.
Well, that's what we should be looking for. We heard there, Jonathan, from Charles, that some people in the UK may be ignorant of what's going on within Europe at the moment. Is the same true, that Europeans no longer understand the British?
I'm sure that's true. The Europeans have been mystified about why Britain has decided to leave the European Union, why it decided to turn its back on its own continent, or at least in their eyes. And I think anything that helps to build a mutual understanding and to provide a forum where people, leaders, can resolve problems and get to know each other. The social issue is extremely important, can only be a good thing, and that can feed through to sort of media representation and therefore to populations as well. You know, we should be building forums, not through the European Union per se, but in a sort of continental forum where different countries in Europe can actually talk to each other and try to resolve some of the specific issues that Europe faces as a continent in a geopolitical space.
Philippe, before I throw something at you, let's hear from Macron himself.
The objective is to share the same understanding of the situation which is affecting Europe and to battle out a common strategy, so a strategic conversation which doesn't really exist at the moment and which could reduce the divisions, and I hope that we can come out of this with a common project. And so there are countries which are members of the European Union, and there are countries which are in the process of trying to join, and there are others who have just left the European Union and others which can't accede. But we all share a common space and sometimes also a common history, and it's in our interests to meet here to write our future together. That is what the European political community is about.
If that's the view now, why did it fail 30 years ago?
Well, I think probably the moment is right. Macron also talked about political intimacy. I think that's an interesting expression in diplomatic terms. I think 30 years ago, or about 30 years ago, a bit more than 30 years ago, you had also another president, French president, François Mitterrand, who came up with this idea of a European confederation. It was just following the fall of the Berlin Wall. And clearly, it didn't work out. I think there was no support for it. It was a big flop. And I think probably when Macron sort of floated the idea of this European political community last May in Strasbourg in a speech, I think there was lots of skepticism exactly because of the Mitterrand precedent. I think what changed is probably simply the political situation, the geopolitical situation in Europe in general. And clearly, it's not the first war on European soil. We had the war in the former Yugoslavia before.
Which may have been one reason why there was division among European countries in the period in which you're talking about, early 90s.
Yes. Yes, and there is still clearly division because we have, on the one hand, sort of European countries, and on the other, Russia and maybe Belarus. That's really what the situation is. And I think probably, I think there's a number of things. It's not simply the question of peace or war in Europe, which is as such is very important, but also the question of energy supply. I think we're talking a lot about it. Winter's coming, rightly so. And the question of migration, also very much linked to one of the possible consequences of war. I think these three big issues are huge. And I think that's why probably now there's an interest in discussing and agreeing on those issues in Europe. And I think everyone is interested in it. Look at the UK and other countries which are not part of the EU are clearly interested in being part of it.
Charles, and this is for all of you really, is it also an opportunity for the bigger countries to twist the arm of their smaller, weaker, less influential near neighbours?
It is a chance to do that, but of course if they try and do it in a nasty way, then it often is counterproductive. I think one thing we haven't touched upon is what kind of follow through or follow up there'll be after the first meeting today. Because the British insisted the whole thing be intergovernmental, meaning no big involvement of the European Union or the European Commission, there isn't a secretariat to take things forward and make sure that any decisions or joint positions get implemented. But I'm a bit worried about whatever nice words they come up with in Prague, there won't be much follow through, and that is a difficult issue. The more intergovernmental you make something, the harder it is to actually get decisions followed through on, though to keep the British happy and others as well, and I think the Turks included, you had to make it intergovernmental, and Macron bent it in the British direction to try and help them there.
Okay, so you fear perhaps that nothing will happen as a result of this simply because somebody isn't taking notes and getting the bureaucracy going?
I think that is a concern, but to which the answer from President Macron might be, well, this isn't a decision-making body like the European Council of the European Union is. It's more just it is a talking shop, but talking shops have a certain value in creating common understanding and mutual trust and building relationships. So there's a certain value even if it is a talking shop. I think it could be a useful talking shop.
And isn't that the problem, Jonathan? It is not a decision-making body. It is, as we've explored here, a wonderful opportunity to socialise, to eat some good food laid on by the host, wherever that host country happens to be, to do the same thing again in 6 months' time, to come away applauding yourself for having embraced European understanding, whereas in fact, you really haven't.
Well, look, I mean, meetings are vital for the running of diplomacy, for the ordinary sort of, the greasing the wheels, if you like. And so it's vital that the leaders of our continent should have a regular opportunity to meet each other, particularly when there are tensions and in some cases outright hostilities between some of those states. I'm not just talking about Russia and Ukraine, obviously Russia isn't invited, but sort of Armenia and Azerbaijan, for example, some of the Balkan neighbours, Greece and Turkey, etc. Obviously there aren't sort of outright hostilities in the latter two cases. But it is important to provide a forum, and there are sidelines on the forums where individual leaders can talk to each other and get to know each other as well. A forum where where disagreements can be laid out, where common agreements can also be established, and that is vital for the workings of ordinary diplomacy. It's not just an opportunity to talk and eat. Talking is how diplomacy works. So you need to have a regular forum where this kind of thing happens, and it could be one such forum. And I suppose I disagree with Charles in one level about the Secretariat. I mean, there's no reason why this community couldn't sort of develop its own Secretariat. If they decide to formalise it, for example, that could be quite a good initiative. And that if it did decide to take on some decision-making responsibilities, then that could be very welcome. And of course, the UK was an active participant in the CFSP, the Common Foreign and Security Policy in the EU, which the UK government has sort of denied in the last couple of years, but it was an active participant. And I think that the UK does have a lot of value to add in terms of foreign policy.
If it has a lot to add, can I ask you this, and then I'll come to you, Charles, if you have an idea based on this one. The UK could contribute, Jonathan. What does the UK want to get out of it? Clear that one up quickly, and then we'll move on to the rest of the countries.
Well, the UK wants to obviously have its voice in the world and amplify its voice. And that's a normal position for countries anywhere in the world to want. And the UK has obviously lost that with
But
the
anything
European Union.
specific? Really, that's what I'm asking.
I don't think there's anything specific apart from possibly migration. The UK wants a lot more cooperation to stop illegal migration, and of course energy as well. The UK wants more help in securing sort of gas and electricity, particularly at the current time.
Charles, I mentioned earlier on Iceland, Albania. We've got 17 countries here. We've got Georgia, we've got Kosovo, Albania, Armenia, Moldova. Do you want to pick one of those and say what you think that specific country might want to get out of this?
Well, I think let me mention two. One is Ukraine, one is Turkey. Ukraine is a country that has become a candidate for membership of the European Union, but we all know that's going to be a decade or two away before actually you see Ukraine joining the EU. And in the meantime, we need to develop a close relationship between Ukraine's leaders and politicians and institutions and those of the other European countries and the EU. So this is a forum where Ukrainians and other Europeans can sit together. But the other example is Turkey. Excuse me, the accession talks between Turkey and the EU have been moribund for a decade or so. Everybody knows that. They're not going anywhere. But Turkey doesn't have a forum where it can sit down with other European leaders and talk about matters of mutual interest, including energy security and migration and all the difficult issues that we have to worry about when we talk to the Turks. I think this could be very useful for Turkey. It gives Turkey a seat at the top European table, which is about time it had one.
Philippe, I've read that Emmanuel Macron wants to leave a mark. This is his last term as president. It's a pretty poor indictment of him if this is the one thing that he's managed to pull together after all of those years as one of the main leaders of the European Union. A chance for people to socialise, chat and get on well.
Yes, indeed. It is pretty true that Macron, since elected first time in 2017, has wanted probably to leave a mark on Europe, in Europe. And so far, he hasn't been very successful. He's made a lot of speeches, floated ideas, proposals, but the trouble is that you need to have your partners, agreeing with you and supporting your proposals. And so far, particularly, he was lacking support, notably from Germany. The support wasn't there, and I think again the circumstances have made that now it is possible. So I think nothing's changed in a way as far as Macron's concerned. He's had an idea really to sort of deepen integration or at least the relationship between European countries. Probably what he didn't have in mind when he started as a president 5 years ago is that he would reach that kind of situation where you have up to 44 countries and 17 of them not being even members of the EU. So that's a very different probably situation than the one he probably first imagined. And I think that could be, we could be reaching the limitations of this, what we regard as a talking shop, which may sound a little bit pejorative, a kind of ad hoc structure, very light, which sort of enables countries which otherwise wouldn't be together to discuss things to be there together.
Well, have you seen an agenda with any real concrete proposals that might come out of this?
I think this is really what marks this structure as different from, say, the EU or any other international organization, is that there is no strict agenda. There is, of course, we know the topics they're going to discuss: Ukraine, security. They're going to talk about energy supply. They're going to talk about migration. But I think all those issues, it will very much depend on the sort of request. For instance, I know the UK, the Prime Minister of the UK, Liz Truss, is going to discuss migration with the French and the Dutch. it would be. I think that's also part of the project. It's not that the 44 countries are going to be all together all the time discussing things. That would be quite difficult. In fact, it enables to have bilateral or trilateral meetings within the overall summit. I think that's probably the way I could see how things could be unfolding.
Two questions for you, Charles, here, and anybody else can pick up on it. Would this have happened if there hadn't been the invasion by Russia of Ukraine? And what are the major differences between the 44 countries over Russia and Ukraine that can perhaps be resolved here?
Well, first question, I think it wouldn't happen in the way it's happening if Russia had not invaded Ukraine. Macron sees the need for Europe as a whole to speak with one voice, relatively speaking. It's the need to have some geopolitical clout and geopolitical strength on the international stage. And Britain's absence and Turkey's absence from the EU and Norway's absence would make it harder for the EU itself to have as much clout as a larger European forum could achieve. That was the first question. So what was the second question?
The second point was, if that is the reason, partly because of what's happened in Ukraine with Russia, what differences between the 44 can be resolved here over that situation?
Well, within the European Union and indeed amongst the wider 44, there are two basic positions on the Ukraine war. There's the Nordic, Baltic, Polish position, which is to be very tough on Russia, isolate Russia, don't compromise, continue the fighting until Ukraine has regained all its territory. That is one position. Then you have a softer position you see quite often in France, Germany, Italy, which is to say Ukraine mustn't lose the war, but let's be realistic. There has to be a negotiation with Russia at some point. Let's not humiliate Putin. Let's find a way of, in the long run, finding a negotiated outcome. Now, those are the divisions amongst the Europeans, but I think at the moment the EU countries have actually managed to paper over those divisions fairly well and avoid falling out badly. And I think the same applies to some of the 44 as well, who are not members of the EU. Norway, for example, is in the tough camp. Turkey obviously is a much softer camp. Turkey wants to maintain a very close relationship with Russia if it can. So I think.
But I don't see that being resolved here.
No, it won't be resolved. But I think, but you're quite right. You can't resolve it in one meeting over a day in Prague, and you're not going to overcome divisions on how to handle the war. But if people talk to each other and explain each other's point of view, they can perhaps reduce the gap between themselves to some degree. That is certainly what French officials tell me. They want the likes of Azerbaijan, Serbia, and Turkey to become a little bit more leaning in the Russian direction, but a bit more leaning in the Western direction. Let's see if it happens or not.
OK, Jonathan, we're running out of time, actually. Does that mean the bigger countries offering inducements to those with whom they disagree at the moment?
I'm not sure that the bigger countries are offering inducements per se, but I certainly think.
Well, we will accelerate your membership of the European Union if you soften your stance, if you like, on the tough line we're taking on Russia.
Well, I don't think that anyone's going to swallow that if that is a line, because countries aren't stupid and they know what the dynamics are behind EU enlargement. And I think they're also mindful, by the way, of this European political community being a holding pen for candidate countries, the EU. They know that countries such as France are quite sceptical of EU enlargement, and there's a feeling that that Macron might want to use this forum to kind of keep these countries outside of the EU, but in this European political community. So that's one thing. But I just think that countries such as, I think it's particularly useful for the UK, which no longer has the forums of the EU, particularly the Political and Security Committee and within the Common Foreign and Security Policy, to press its viewpoint on Ukraine, particularly with arming and funding, because there is going to be wavering in the coming months that Charles was alluding to over just how much support can be supplied to Ukraine in a massive energy crunch, during a cost of living crisis, during an economic crisis, which is accelerating in Europe as well. And I think it's useful for a country like Britain to try and impress upon other countries that this is a moral as well as an economic issue. And it's also a political issue in the sense that, if you allow Ukraine to lose, then Russia is not going to stop at Ukraine. And I suppose that the forum is another way to allow the UK to impress its position.
It is like a massive game of international Jenga with now 44 different pieces all added and all relying on each other for support. How long will it last? European political community. We haven't heard the last of it, or maybe we have. Who knows? Thank you very much indeed for coming on Roundtable. Thank you for watching the show. Until next time, goodbye.